Greetings, friends and strangers. It is still April 18th. However, the day is Saturday. I was a little precipitous yesterday with my date, but I think that I can be forgiven for it's hard to know what day it is these days. In this time of Corona 19, our contemporary plague. So let me just adjust this here. If you're, oh, I'm a little crooked. Why didn't somebody tell me? Just kidding. I'm alone. All right. Well, I thought that today I would begin with the prologue, which I skipped yesterday, because rereading it this morning, I think that it's definitely worth hearing. So here we go. This is the foreword written by Barbara Tuchman, written in 1978, okay, or published anyway in 1978. And forward, the period, the protagonist, the hazards. The genesis of this book was a desire to find out what were the effects on society of the most lethal disaster of recorded history. That is to say, of the Black Death of 1348 to 50, which killed an estimated 1/3 of the living between India and Iceland. Given the possibilities of our own time, the reason for my interest is obvious. The answer proved elusive because the 14th century suffered so many strange and great perils and adversities, in the words of a contemporary, that its disorders cannot be traced to any one cause. They were the hoofprints of more than the 4 horsemen of St. John's vision, which had now become 7. Plague, war, taxes, brigandage, bad government, insurrection, and schism in the church. All but plague itself arose from conditions that existed prior to the Black Death and continued after the period of the plague was over. Although my initial question has escaped an answer, the interest of the period itself, a violent, tormented, bewildered, suffering, and disintegrating age, a time, as many thought, of Satan triumphant, was compelling and, as it seemed to me, consoling in a period of similar disarray. If our last decade or two of collapsing assumptions has been a period of unusual discomfort, it is reassuring to know that the human species has lived through worse before. Curiously, the phenomenal parallels have been applied by another historian to earlier years of this century. Comparing the aftermaths of the Black Death and of World War I, James Westfall Thompson found all the same complaints: economic chaos, social unrest, high prices, profiteering, depraved morals, lack of production, industrial indolence, frenetic gaiety, wild expenditure, luxury, debauchery, social and religious hysteria, greed, avarice, maladministration, decay of manners. History never repeats itself, Voltaire said. Man always does. And I'll just end the introduction there, and we can move ahead to the Black Death, chapter 5. All right. So, I think I ended with a Welsh lament and a description of the buboes of the plague. So let's continue there. Rumors of a terrible plague supposedly arising in China and spreading through Tartary, Central Asia, to India and Persia, Mesopotamia, Syria, Egypt, and all of Asia Minor had reached Europe in 1346. They told of a death toll so devastating that all of India was said to be depopulated. Whole territories covered by dead bodies. Other areas with no one left alive. As added up by Pope Clement VI at Avignon, the total reported dead reached 23,840,000. In the absence of concept of contagion, no serious alarm was felt in Europe until the trading ships brought their black burden of pestilence into Messina, while other infected ships from the Levant carried it to Genoa and Venice. By January 1348, it had penetrated France via Marseille and North Africa via Tunis. Shipborne along coasts and navigable rivers, it spread westward from Marseille through the ports of Languedoc to Spain, northward up the Rhone to Avignon, where it arrived in March. It reached Narbonne, Montpellier, Carcassonne, and Toulouse between February and May. And at the same time, Italy spread to Rome and Florence and their hinterlands. Between June and August, it reached Bordeaux, Lyon, and Paris, spread to Burgundy and Normandy, and crossed the Channel from Normandy into southern England. From Italy, during the same summer, it crossed the Alps into Switzerland and reached eastward to Hungary. In a given area, the plague accomplished its kill within 4 to 6 months, and then faded, except in the larger cities, where rooting into the close-quartered population, it abated during winter, only to reappear in the spring and rage for another 6 months. In 1349, it resumed in Paris and spread to Picardy and Flanders and the Low Countries, and from England to Scotland and Ireland, as well as to Norway, where a ghost ship with cargo of wool and a dead crew drifted offshore until it ran aground near Bergen. From there, the plague passed into Sweden, Denmark, Prussia, Iceland, and as far as Greenland, leaving a strange pocket of immunity in Bohemia and Russia, unattacked until 1351. It had passed from most of Europe by mid-1350. Although the mortality rate was erratic, ranging from 1/5 in some places to 9/10 or almost total elimination in others, the overall estimate of modern demographers has settled for the area extending from India to Iceland around the same figure expressed in Froissart's casual words, 1/3 of the world died. His estimate, the common one at the time, was not an inspired guess, but a borrowing of St. John's figure for mortality from the plague in Revelation, the favorite guide to human affairs of the Middle Ages. 1/3 of the world would have meant about 20 million deaths. No one knows in truth how many died. Contemporary reports were an odd impression, not an accurate count. In crowded Avignon, it was said 400 died daily. 7,000 houses emptied by death were shut up. A single graveyard received 11,000 corpses in 6 weeks. Half the city's inhabitants reportedly died, including 9 cardinals, or 1/3 of the total, and 70 lesser prelates. Watching the endlessly passing death carts, chroniclers let normal exaggeration take wings and put the Avignon death toll at 62,000 and even at 120,000, although the city's total population was probably less than 50,000. When graveyards filled up, bodies at Avignon were thrown into the Rhone until mass burial pits were dug for dumping the corpses. In London, such pits, corpses piled up in layers until they overflowed. Everywhere reports speak of the sick and dying, dying too fast for the living to bury. Corpses were dragged out of homes and left in front of doorways. Morning light revealed new piles of bodies. In Florence, the dead were gathered up by the Compagnia della Misericordia, founded in 1244 to care for the sick. Those members wore red robes and hoods masking the face except for the eyes. When their efforts failed, the dead lay putrid in the streets for days at a time. When no coffins were to be had, the bodies were laid on boards, 2 or 3 at once, to be carried to the graveyard or common pits. Families dumped their own relatives into the pits, or buried them so hastily and thinly that dogs dragged them forth and devoured their bodies. Amid accumulating death and fear of contagion, people died without last rites or were buried without prayers, a prospect that terrified the last hours of the stricken. A bishop in England gave permission to laymen to make confession to each other, as was done by the apostles, or, if no man is present, then even to a woman. And if no priest could be found to administer extreme unction, then faith must suffice. Clement VI found it necessary to grant remission of sin to all who died of the plague, because so many were unattended by priests, and no bells tolled, wrote a chronicler in Siena, and nobody wept, no matter what his loss, because almost everyone expected death. And people said and believed, "This is the end of the world." In Paris, where the plague lasted through 1349, the reported death rate was 800 a day, in Pisa 500, in Vienna 500 to 600. The total dead in Paris numbered 50,000, or half the population. Florence, weakened by the famine of 1347, lost 3 to 4/5 of its citizens. Venice, 2/3. Hamburg and Bremen, though smaller in size, about the same proportion. Cities as centers of transportation were more likely to be affected than villages, although once a village was affected, its death rate was equally high. At Givry, a prosperous village in Burgundy of 1,200 to 1,500 people, the parish register records 615 deaths in the space of 14 weeks, compared to an average of 30 deaths a year in the previous decade. In 3 villages of Cambridgeshire, manorial records show a death rate of 47%, 57%, and in one case 70%. When the last survivors, too few to carry on, moved away, a deserted village sank back into the wilderness and disappeared from the map altogether, leaving only a grass-covered, ghostly outline to show where mortals had once lived. In enclosed spaces such as monasteries and prisons, the infection of one person usually meant that all, as it happened in the Franciscan convent. Let me read that again. In enclosed spaces such as monasteries and prisons, the infection of one person usually meant that of all, as happened in the Franciscan convents of Narbonne and Marseille, where every inmate without exception died. Of the 140 Dominicans at Montpellier, only 7 survived. Petrarch's brother, Gerardo, member of the Carthusian monastery, buried the prior and 34 fellow monks one by one, sometimes 3 a day, until he was left alone with his dog and fled to look for a place that would take him in. Watching every comrade die, men in such places could not but wonder whether the strange peril that filled the air had not been sent to exterminate the human race. In Kilkenny, Ireland, Brother John Klyn of the Friars Minor, another monk left alone among dead men, kept a record of what happened, lest things should be remembered perish with time and vanish from the memory of those who come after us. Sensing the whole world, as it were, placed within the grasp of the evil one, and waiting for death to visit him too, he wrote, "I leave parchment to continue this work, if perchance any man survive, and any of the race of Adam escape this pestilence, and carry on the work which I have begun." Brother John, as noted by another hand, died of the pestilence, but he foiled oblivion. All right, I think I'm going to leave it there for today. Solid 15 minutes. Thank you for joining me in this reading of A Distant Mirror, the calamitous 14th century, specifically the Plague chapter. I do find it interesting to read the perspectives of people from another time, and I hope that it lends you some perspective too. Thanks for joining me.